Barry has always been a challenging show to manage. The show, which seemed determined to always be one step ahead of the audience, positioned itself as Breaking Bad Speedball, a half-hour comedy ostensibly about a disgraced alchemist and soldier who turns into a hitman after realizing his homicidal skill set is useless in contemporary life. The show has always been interested in performance, not just in the film industry. Everyone in this cast does not view acting as any sort of vocation. It's what people require in order to cope with themselves, possibly to comprehend and communicate their emotions, as well as to defend their worst errors. Although the process of making art can serve as a useful tool for self-examination, it can also serve to encourage self-deception. In Season 2, Sally Reed came to represent this idea. She initially intended to tell the story of her violent marriage honestly, but she instead chose to gloss over the difficult and unattractive details of their divorce and create a falsely empowered conclusion for herself. Ironically, though, she discovered that her revised story was well-liked by viewers. In fact, because its edges had been smoothed over, it likely attracted more viewers in Season 3. Hollywood depends heavily on happy endings. But the Sally Reed who first appears in WoW has long ago left the acting business and has already taken up a motherly role, which is a more sustained form of acting. But she has found it difficult to fully embrace this new position, and the most recent episodes haven't held back in depicting her as a careless and emotionally distant parent. Sally has perhaps been the most empathetic character on this program, but the last 2 seasons and especially have highlighted her worst traits and refused to soften her character. However, I noticed that when Sally first began to open up to her son, I started to cry. Not only did she give him the truth about why their family relocates so frequently, but she also gave herself permission to truly adore and look at him. Sally feels as though she hasn't been completely honest with herself in nearly 10 years when she tells John that she deserves whatever happens to her and attempts to convince him that he's a decent man. And as she continuously apologizes, John rushes over to hug her and clings to her while she does so. I suddenly found myself wishing against hope that there was some sort of escape for them. The fact that the show ultimately gives Sally and John a way out is not a major surprise. Although Barry is a dark show, it is rarely wholly without hope. The moral cosmos of this series is consistent, and in this final, one pattern emerges. Those who conceal their actual selves will suffer the consequences, whilst those who endure the agony of seeing themselves clearly will be granted mercy. The purpose of the final Noel Hankstein is to make Hank face his flip to the dark side when Fuchs appears for what appears to be his long-awaited retribution on Barry. Instead, Fuchs is more interested in defending John. Even better, he offers him a new deal. If Hank admits killing Cristobal, Fuchs will leave and never come back. Hank cancels the agreement as you might anticipate, at which point he is fatally shot. However, he does experience one more genuine sadness, sobbing that all he wanted was to be protected. Hank learned this lesson during his time in the Bolivian prison at the conclusion of Season 3, which cost him his love of his life and forced him to accept the fact that he could only survive by taking on a different identity. Hank holds the hand of the statue of Cristobal when the gunfight at Nohobel comes to an end, providing a fitting conclusion to their tragic love tale. When someone is given an easy way out and choose to disregard it, it's a classic Barry move, and right now, Fuchs is like a deity passing judgment. He's one of the characters on the show who has grown the most in an odd way because of his story about accepting who he was in prison. Yes, he's a murderous kingpin who decapitated 4 people less than 24 hours ago. But he no longer harbors the fantasy that he could ever be a true mentor to someone like Barry. The most he can do is protect John and safely return him when Barry arrives. After a lengthy exchange of wordless eye contact, during which both men felt the weight of their past, they eventually parted ways. Retaliation on any side is no longer necessary. Barry doesn't necessarily see clearly now, though. That God spared him and that he has been redeemed is what he learned most from the extraction effort. Sally, who has been revived after spending 8 years outside of her body, doesn't absolve him this time. She confirms what we already knew. The only way to be completely atoned for the murder of Janice Moss is by genuinely accepting responsibility and handing himself in. If not, Gene will be prosecuted for the crime. Sally and John left the next morning, so Barry obviously has no intention of following their counsel. He assumes that they are with Gene when he initially arrives, but they're not. Barry is urged to turn himself up in order to save Gene by Tom, who answers the door. A lengthy close-up of Barry's face is then shown as he gradually comes to the realization that he won't ever see his family again and decides to give himself in. Even if Barry loses all he loves about, it's a pivotal time nonetheless. Barry would never have been willing to make this sacrifice before a few seconds ago, but too much harm has already been done. Too many opportunities for redemption have been presented. It's a horrible irony that Gene kills him with Chekhov's gun just as he makes up his mind to act morally. It's never too late to make a change on Barry until it is. We receive some resolution to the ultimate fates of the remaining characters when WoW fast-forwards another 10 years. Even though Sally and John's new life isn't quite a happy ending, they're at least given some peace. Although Sally still has doubts about the caliber of her work, she has found some satisfaction in her role as high school theater director. It makes natural that neither she nor her kid are totally well-adjusted individuals, after her experiences with two violent men, one of whom was a serial killer. Sally is probably never going to allow herself to fall in love again. Although it's encouraging to see that she and her son at least have one another, there are worse lifestyles to have. That evening, John spends the night with a friend where they eventually get around to watching the Barry Berkman biopic. A cynical reinterpretation of the entire show is what we witness unfold over the space of a few minutes. It's basically an altered version of the hoax that Jim Moss, the DA, and Leo Cousineau concocted in A Nice Meal. This is no longer the story of a violent man who used his acting teacher to his advantage before killing his girlfriend and threatening to kill his family. Rather, it is now the tale of a military hero who, upon learning that his mentor was a murderer, unintentionally fell into the world of crime and drugs and was killed by the teacher when he refused to participate. These pictures of Gene Cousineau and Barry Berkman will last far longer than the actual individuals themselves. Watching this fabrication unfold while knowing that Jim Moss wanted to keep his daughter's story from being transformed into some exploitative thriller that is even less true than the original script Warner Bros. Envisioned is very unnerving. Gene is languishing in a life sentence in prison for 2 counts of first-degree murder, only one of which was ever committed, while Barry is laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery with full honors and is lovingly recalled despite the numerous people he injured. Maybe Barry's legacy is some kind of compensation for his last-minute change of heart. However, it's more likely Gene is getting his just desserts because he twisted the reality to make his suffering into content. He is to blame for how the truth turned out differently than he had planned. The most puzzling and ambiguous part of this conclusion, though, is the expression John wears as the show comes to a close. Loss, but also catharsis. It reminded me of all the embellished stories that have given these characters significance throughout the years, such as Sally's representation of her marriage, Gene's one-man show, or Barry's different military anecdotes. Barry is portrayed in films as being a nicer man than he actually is, which is why he would have preferred for his kid to see this and Sally doesn't. But no matter how ridiculous everything is, this Hollywood nonsense still manages to give John some improbable solace, since he now knows his father will be remembered as a nice man, for better or worse. The things that stick aren't necessarily, or even often, the facts. Everyone has a story to tell, and stories are what survive. The biggest irony, of course, is that Gene might have spared himself a life sentence to prison if he had let Barry to live. After everything he's been through, killing him might feel good, but it also guarantees that Barry's version of the reality will endure even after they're both gone. After all, he was the only person who had the ability to save Gene, a truth that he either didn't accept or purposefully disregarded. The final words of Barry as he encounters the shooter are the source of this finale's title. It's a cute little incident, and possibly the last evidence that Barry underestimated the suffering he had brought about.